Hello, this is Dr. John Spink, and this is our pre-conference release of our presentation, and this is presented as a resource for the attendees to use now and in the future. It will be posted on our website. And this is for Interpol Operation Opson meetings, and it's the debriefing from Operation 8 and the launch of Operation 9. And this is occurring in Athens, Greece, November 6th, 7th, 8th in 2019. And I've been asked to talk about food fraud prevention strategy, and specifically food fraud suspicious activity report methods and country-level food fraud vulnerability assessments. And I am John Spink. I'm director of the Food Fraud Prevention Academy. In addition, I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State University, and I've recently moved to the Business College in the Department of Supply Chain Management, which is an interesting different way to look at the same problem, looking at it from as a supply chain problem, as a business problem, and also as a procurement problem. So it's just a different way to look at the same problem. Usually we've been looking at it from the criminology perspective, or really the product and product testing perspective. With me is Dr. Roy Fenoff from the Citadel University in South Carolina here in the US, and he's an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology. So together we bring a really unique approach. Our website is foodfraudprevention.com if you've got any questions. Thank you. I'll get started. First off, just a little background on our curriculum and our focus. On the right, you'll see this cycle: research, education, and outreach. So even talking with the conference organizers here, we learned a lot about some emerging questions, issues, and in that outreach leads us to understand some new research areas. So we go back and research it, even some things that have gone into this presentation, and then we publish those, we share them, and then that works its way into education itself, which is back to outreach. The main way that we communicate our work is through free online courses. These are called MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. There's a certificate of completion based upon the assessment. It's equivalent to 10 contact hours. And the four that we have going at this point, we have several in development, are a Food Fraud Overview MOOC. And that's just the basic background. We've got an audit guide for food fraud. So that's people that are auditing or being audited with compliance requirements there. And then a food defense audit guide. This is kind of a parallel away from food fraud, but these non-traditional food safety risks, vulnerabilities, are something that the food industry is addressing right now. So we also cover food defense. And then the overarching concept is this whole idea of the food fraud vulnerability assessment and critical control point plan, or VASIP, and that's our fourth MOOC. We also have a lot of other things. We conduct conferences. We have executive education, and then I'm very proud of my recent release of new textbook on food fraud prevention, and this definitely applies to countries as well as companies. And there's the QR code link there. There'll be a URL at the end of the presentation, or you can just look on the internet. So one thing we did with the conference organizers is looked at a Opson and MSU survey, and looking at the preliminary results here. We had 14 responses. Completion rate was 86%, so people that started did it. A quick run through, less than 10 minutes. And our goal was to really review the Opson member activities, insight, and needs. And the objective was to inform our Opson meeting content. So it was a very short time window. The survey is still open. We'll be collecting information over time as well. But we wanted to present that overall focus. And so here are the results of that survey. To start, one of the key questions was, what does your organization consider to be the scope of your food fraud activities or prevention program? Select all that apply. And what you'll see here is the results there. We looked at the different types of food fraud: adulterant substances, tampering, theft, smuggling, gray market theft or diversion, counterfeiting, intellectual property rights, or others. Then we also have don't know or prefer not to answer. The key is a lot of the Opson focus has been on intellectual property rights in the past. But it's interesting here to see that the focus of the members cover the wide range of product fraud and food fraud. So the insight here is there needs to be further analysis by individual responses, specifically as all other types that may have been selected to cover everything instead of identifying the other items. Interesting that less than 45% of the Opson members do not consider theft or gray market diversion in the scope. That's interesting because that product a lot of times is not illegal, and that might be why it's considered to be more of a commercial problem than maybe a criminal problem. Less than 70% considered adulterant substances and also intellectual property rights in scope. And this is, by definition, the Opson scope. Which here's what's interesting is that for the defined Opson scope, only 70% of the responses felt that that was their focus area. That was in their focus area. So some of the attendees, the people that are involved with Opson, that are members of Opson, don't actually either have the interest or the statutory boundaries or allowance for them to cover all the types of issues. And this is interesting from a long-term standpoint to look at things like this type of research. Bottom line, our recommendation is for all companies and countries is to start by considering all types of fraud. The fraudsters are looking at all types of fraud, and this is the most efficient way to look at the big picture. The next question that really applies is, has your organization conducted a food fraud vulnerability assessment? And this is intentionally left broad without a definition just to see what people say. And it is interesting there that many said yes, a lot said no, and some didn't know. So there again, with even the few number of responses of people that are assigned to be here, they weren't sure. So what we see here is this is really overall looking at risk management 101, the real basics, and that's building on the ISO standard, International Standards Organization 31000, and really the goal there is to establish the context and then look at that risk assessment. So even as these people are starting to look at food fraud, we're looking at the bigger picture and the broader issues. The insight from the survey is this is the most significant finding, that over half the respondents have not conducted an assessment of their overall food fraud risks. Without a priority setting system, then, the efforts are ad hoc and reactionary. The crime fighting resources should be optimized by focusing on the worst problems. A key here is that you can't say you're working on the most important worst problems if you haven't done an assessment of it. You can guess at what they are, but again, you don't have this assessment. People think this is really hard to do, and it is theoretically, but you can start very simple, and that's a real key, something that we'll get into a little later in the presentation, is to look more at the way you can get started. And there's really some very, very effective ways to get started. So this is helping inform our presentation that's coming up. The bottom line recommendation is conduct a food fraud vulnerability assessment. Again, if you don't have an assessment of the worst problems, the worst vulnerabilities or risks, you can't say you're working on the most problematic areas. So these questions 6, 7, 8, and 9 basically are looking broadly at, does food fraud fit within the overall Interpol-Europol mission? Now this is important to step back, because some people will say, well, this is not what we do. And so maybe if some countries have more of a focus on stopping smuggling or tax avoidance, tariff issues, then they may not feel that getting into food is something that's their focus area. But the insight is there's almost unanimous support for food fraud prevention to be within the scope and mission of Opson and Interpol-Europol. Key with this is not just within Opson itself, but also within Interpol and Europol. So we don't have any doubt and any lack of support for addressing food fraud. Question 12, what is the long-term vision for how should Interpol-Europol address food fraud? So really it's interesting to look more broadly at this. Different types of comments were submitted in here, and we then kind of synthesize those down. Really what we see is continue the effort, and that's definitely something that's a part of the long-term vision. Disrupt organized crime groups. This is really difficult, and it's when you start to say, well, yes, of course we want to disrupt, but to do what? Is it just arresting people, or is it seizing their equipment? Is it shutting down transportation lanes? And at least then we're getting to a very specific question. Share information on infringement. This is a biggie. And if you're conducting your own vulnerability assessment, it's interesting to know what your neighboring countries or other countries in the Europol group, what they have as problems as well. It's also very difficult to share some of that very sensitive information sometimes. Much greater focus on prevention. That's a key. That's very difficult. This has always been an aspiration of criminology, to really look at prevention, not just catching the bad guys, but reducing the opportunity. I think that's something that we'll cover in our presentation here, driven by your questions, and that's the real key focus, and it's got to shift that way. Being reactionary, and we're never going to rest our way to safety or protection. There's not enough investigators, courts, prisons, things like that. We really need to look at prevention, and that's something that's really a more modern criminology theory, looking at things like situational crime prevention. Our recommendation really is utilize seizure data and insight to create crime prevention strategy and target hardening. So expanding on that is looking at preventing it by making the targets harder, making it more difficult or costly for the bad guys to commit their crimes. Best practices. To step back a little bit before really saying, what's a recommendation for how to start for the member states that are here represented at Opson, is looking at best practices that are implemented already. And a lot of times the industry has implemented these based on a lot of different types of necessity and maybe less regulatory pressures or constrictions. And we'll look at the best practices. First off is looking at industry. And a key is whatever you're going to do from a regulatory government side is to see what's already being done in industry. And a real key is that there's 2 required documents for these food fraud prevention activities in industry. This is based on the Global Food Safety Initiative benchmarking, and that's then implemented in things like the Food Safety Management System standards. So you might be more familiar with things like BRC, FSSC 22000, SQF, IFS, or other standards. The first requirement is a food fraud vulnerability assessment, and really to clarify the details, and you'll see a heat map there. And that's something I'll show how it does apply to governments as well. But the key is companies are big. A lot of the companies are very big, and they've applied this. Also then include a food fraud prevention strategy. So it's one thing to just go out and act. It's another to have an actual strategy. And I'll share with this, and there's also links that I've got to previous presentations that looked at the management system in place, the way to organize information, and the key is looking at the fraud opportunity and controlling that, reducing the opportunity for the crime to occur. But so these are both in place already with companies. And these are things that the companies may share with you if you're talking to them about food fraud prevention in an entire country or region. Next, to look at a best practice. And I was able to interact with Trinidad and Tobago, the country in the Caribbean. Beautiful. Nice to be there in the nice winter months when it's cold for me. But a key is they've got this executive summary, and it's something that I see as really a best practice around the world. And there's a number of reasons why I see it as a best practice. They define food fraud, even if only as a summary of other laws and regulations. And it really is already illegal, but they're defining this. And the thing they're looking at here is, that they're looking at this definition, and it's something that they're moving forward with to really clearly define that food fraud term. Now, a challenge in the EU has been an EU-wide common definition, or agreed to definition formal, but there's still a basic definition in scope that is common. And so set that definition, just state what the definition is for your project. Centrally entrusted interdisciplinary interagency task force. Next is they defined that they had a need for the establishment of a designated regulatory body to prevent and detect cases of food fraud in Trinidad and Tobago, and that's a real key. And they then move forward to designate that body to really focus on this activity. So they're laying out really clear in their parliament what's the recommendation to move forward. It's very clear. And then review if desired outcomes achieved by the current processes. So looking at if the actions they put in place are actually leading to prevention, and that's a real key, that they've had this focus not only on the regulatory compliance, but looking at actually preventing the problems and harms in the marketplace. Next is just talk about what's been available for us to look at in the way of standards. And a real simple and key source is ISO 31000, and that's risk management. And a couple things there that they have created that really help us understand the very first steps for us is, at the very beginning, is establishing the context. And this is defining the external and internal parameters, the context, what you're doing, to be taken into account when managing risk and setting the scope and risk criteria for risk management policy. So bottom line, if you're a country or your Interpol itself is looking at, what is our scope and what are our activities. And this is really key to identify the resources that you have, as well as again, the full scope. This is establishing the context. This would be defining all fraud as the issue. And then once you look further, at this point, it's all fraud, but then you have to think about what are the priorities. And it starts with risk identification. That's where information sharing is very key between the countries. And in HACCP terms for food safety, this would be called hazard identification. So you're looking at all types of fraud, but then you're looking at specific types of risks. So it could be, one thing that can happen is the adulterant substances that an illegal substance is put in the product, such as melamine, and there could be that's some type of risk, and there's other type of hazards that would occur. And with that, you do a risk analysis. You'd look at what's happening and what is the impact. Now, when we look at food, we think of public health threats, but Interpol and Europol have a broader scope looking at economic impacts as well. So it's beyond that, just that public health. It could be the amount of economic loss to a region. And in HACCP terms, for food safety, this would be a combined step of hazard identification and hazard assessment. So we say we're going to establish the context is looking at all product fraud. And then to define where we're going to focus, we need to then conduct this risk identification. This is looking at what does occur, what incidents have occurred, what suspicious activity is out there. And then do the risk analysis to identify which ones are the worst. That's where we're digging closer, and that's something we'll look at in the next slide, but that's where we're getting down to more detail. And then there's the concept of risk evaluation. So we've got this analysis of what risk is out there, and the evaluation helps us to prioritize which ones are the worst and why. Once you do identify this and plot it on something like a heat risk map, then you can have a discussion with your agency, with your government, with industry about your priorities, what you're working on, and why you're working on them, and how they can help and really to look at this. And the key is that risk evaluation helps to set a starting point for that focus. That's when you look at risk treatments then. And there's a combination here that's really important when you're prioritizing. One is to look at the worst risks, but also then considering which ones of those do you have the most impact on. There's some things that, say it's production in another country. So in your own country, you don't have a lot of control of what happens in another country. Now, something you do have a lot of control of is something like product moving across the borders. So it might be more efficient, even though there might be a big problem that's occurring outside your country, with your risk treatment, your effective response might be something different. And so when you're looking at a risk treatment that's efficient, it's a combination of understanding the worst hazards, the worst risks, in relation to what you can have the most impact on. If you could do things like seize illegal counterfeit manufacturing machinery in your country and destroy it, not just seize it and sell it, but destroy it, it's a fundamental shift in the fraud opportunity. That if the bad guys don't have the machinery to make the fraudulent product, you are fundamentally changing that. That's very, very efficient in the sense of applying a risk treatment. If you seize product, that's great that product's not in the marketplace. But the thing is if that production is still going on, they may just run another shift or build another plant to help get around your seizures. You're not going to seize your way to safety, but if you start to destroy seize equipment, you will. So the way we've looked at this, it starts with something called enterprise risk management. And this was first developed to meet U.S. regulatory requirements for financial reporting. And this would be public companies in the U.S. are required to conduct this type of analysis under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The key for us is that this is a system that's already in place, and it's already being implemented, evaluated, and utilized. So there's best practices we can apply to an entire market, industry, or a government. And to apply that ISO 31000 concept, we look at risk analysis and the hazard identification. That's the first step. And you'll notice on the chart we've got likelihood and consequence. Risk is a combination of those two. And these are key ISO 31000 terms. I highly recommend if you're starting fresh, or you can change, adjust to these terms, because these are terms that are really more supported in the research and more simple to use. Likelihood is how often something would occur. And you can debate once a year, once every other year, once 10 years, and consequence is that impact. And really to judge the magnitude of that problem is to consider both of them at the same time. Something that's very, very impactful but rarely ever happens would be down at that low end. Now, you're still concerned about it, but it would be something that would fall lower on that risk map. What we look at here is this risk decision making, or risk tolerance or appetite. Now, as a government, as an agency, you might be thinking this is all business things. These are the business industry, but hold on. In another slide or two, I'll discuss this about how it applies to governments. But really, overall, based on the core theory, there are these things called tolerance. We don't reduce every type of crime. So there's a priority setting. Also, courts don't prosecute. Don't choose every type of crime to prosecute. There is a tolerance that we have. Every culture is different. Every society is different. There's a lot of different resources. In the midst of some type of crisis, there may be a different shifting priority. So a key, there is something there where you get funding for some things and you don't get funded for others. You get funded for some things, you get defunded. Different areas get defunded. So there is something there, and this is all based on that COSO and ISO 31000. The key is when you look at this A, B, and C, is you want to have something that, so once we do an assessment for an entire country, then you can use this for a new threat. So let's say that a new issue, a new suspicious activity or counterfeit product shows up. This now gives you a mechanism to assess that problem. So as soon as it comes in, if you have the right questions to ask, you know if it's A, B, or C. Is it in the red zone, yellow, or down in the blue zone? So there could be a counterfeiting problem going on, a product fraud problem, but if the likelihood is very low and the consequence is low, then that's a lower priority. Now, if you have unlimited resources, absolutely deal with every one, but that's not the case for most people. And then to know also this in the A zone that's in the red, that you all of a sudden hear about this problem, you conduct this assessment, and remember, this is with the likelihood and consequence that's been agreed upon. These are calibrated terms in there. Even though it says very high, there'd be some type of way to figure out what's a high versus a very high. So if you found that problem that came in and you ran the numbers and you found that it was in the A zone in the red, then you know that this is a crisis. You know from your previous assessment this is something that needs to be elevated very quickly and is very serious. That's the ultimate goal here, that we have some way for you to calibrate how bad is bad. And again, when you bring this forward and talk about that A item being bad, we now have another discussion and we keep recalibrating what really does count as a very high. So I constantly get this pushback but that won't work for government, right? Well, because it looks like, well, that sounds very easy. It's the stock price, it's economic loss, to the company's loss of sales. Yes, that is in a way that's a bit more simple to apply, but the core concepts apply to any type of risk or vulnerability. And the example I'll use is the U.S. government. So here's two of our Government Accountability Office reports looking at the standards for internal control in the federal government and selected agencies' experience to illustrate good practices in managing risk. And on the bottom there is the COSO cube. That's an ERM cube. So that's the same concept. This is enterprise risk management. Notice the title there, enterprise risk management. This is exactly what we've been talking about. So when we look at these U.S. reports, these are public reports, so you can definitely find them. It's called a Green Book. It's a commonly used name for the standards for internal control in the federal government. So you could, if you're not from the U.S., you could use this as a foundation, as a reference. So you didn't make this up yourself. This is something that's actually implemented, and there's a lot of examples of the implementation. In there is defined a risk tolerance. So again, if someone says, well, we don't accept any type of risk, well, yeah, every type of problem, every type of counterfeiting is unacceptable. But when we start to focus the resources and we start to look at which ones we're going to call a crisis, the risk tolerance is defined in these documents, and it's the acceptable level of variance in the performance relative to the achievement of objectives. So there's a risk tolerance there that's definitely defined. And second is looking at an internal control. So you see that in the top document on the right, standards for internal control. This is based on those original risk concepts as well. And an internal control is a process used by management to help an entity achieve its objectives. So this is just a way that we have a structured way to move forward. And here in the GAO reports, they talked about the US where different agencies could use the same general type of processes. Then everybody's not reinventing the wheel separately. We can use these general concepts and share best practices. A real tough thing is to look at these limits. What are the objectives and limits? What do you focus on? And it's defined in there that management with oversight by an oversight body. So this is your division inside an agency, inside addressing a regulatory action or law, sets the objectives to meet the entity's mission, strategic plan, and goals and requirements of applicable laws and regulations. So it does mention in there this focus on how you manage and how you prioritize your activities. Principle 6 in there specifically is define objectives and risk tolerances. Now this is really uncomfortable for some people because again we're saying that all types of product fraud is unacceptable, yes, but every type of product fraud is not a crisis, is not stop everything and fly everybody to that port or to look at that product. And that's really important to set these risk tolerances. This helps also to set just realistic expectations. Management defines risk tolerances in specific and measurable terms so they are clearly stated and can be measured. That's a real key. So this new product fraud issue that pops up, you can run the numbers, look at the assessment, and identify if it's in your A, B, or C. Is it in the red zone, the yellow zone, which is a question area on the tolerance, or a C zone, which is within your risk tolerance? Still a concern, but within risk tolerance. So that's the challenge. Wow, you got all through that. Hopefully you figure that it has been done, it can be done, but how to start? This is such a challenge, and this is something that we had to deal with industry, and it applies to the member states and countries and agencies as well. And what we do here is we look at current projects and write them on a big whiteboard. And this is a basic foundation that applies to any new or emerging question. Just so write down everything that you're working on and doing. And most likely, they're a set of separate activities. You worked on cargo theft for one type of product, and then you worked on tampering of another type of product. You worked on smuggling of one, adulterant substances on another. So now that we put those all together, we start to tie them under a single strategy. One thing that's great there is you now see these different type of activities. They can help when you're working in one area where you have transparency of the supply chain or some type of traceability, some type of testing, that can help other parts of prevention. That's how you start into an overall strategy. So in here, an article that you may know, one of our colleagues here, Peter Whelan from Ireland, was one of our co-authors on this, and this is looking at how to start. So this is a basic foundation that applies to new or emerging questions. And a key that this has been applied many times in industry and is starting to be considered by agencies as well. And you'll see there an academic article there if you really want to get into it. What we recommend is it's called this Food Fraud Task Force. So even if you have a lot of activity going on, start a new project just to look at it. If you have a lot of activity going on, this is really just a check for best practice, a process check, a management check. And if you haven't started, then you're in good shape because we've got some direction for you. And to start is convene the task force. Identify who the people are, the length of the project, and who they'll be presenting to specifically. First, we go through this idea of really creating this enterprise-wide food fraud policy or mission statement. Now, you may already have it, which is great, but then you review it for your application, and that helps you to begin drafting a food fraud prevention strategy or plan. Again, you may already have a plan as well, but put those together and start to look at it. At this point, we're looking at the big picture. We're looking at the mission, the vision, the overall goals, and then conduct this pre-filter initial screening. We have a lot of training of this free in our MOOCs online, and we've actually got some examples of country level, and I'll show you one later. And one I did by myself, and then another time I did it with just a couple people, and we looked at an entire country of all types of food fraud for the country. A key is you want to look at the very high level first, and then now you can debate about it, fight about it, discuss it, adjust it, but you have an assessment that's complete. Even though it's very light, this is qualitative, it's not quantitative yet. You don't have a lot of data, And most times it's based on subject matter expert insight. So there's people that have been operating in the space, because the goal is to first complete an assessment just at a very high level. Now, as you get more information, it becomes more and more quantitative, or there's more analysis that goes into defining what is a medium or what is a low. But you start this first one, and again, as I said, you'll see the example of what we've used in the past. Review additional needs, including additional information for a more detailed food fraud vulnerability assessment. So you like the one that we show here, it's a very high level. There's a lot of areas of their country products that we didn't know about. And so we identified those. Those would be areas where if there was the next step, it would be one step deeper. And you then go gather information. Maybe you would ask people in the northern region to, for their insight on this. Maybe someone in a different seafood market. So you go deeper, but the key is you've started and you've got this perspective of the entire country. Now you know where there are the gaps, or again, where you need to have more detail. Review the specific food fraud vulnerabilities in an enterprise risk map. This is ERM. So now that you've got the assessment, you've established the context, you've looked at incidents, you've done this assessment, now you want to plot it. You want to go all the way to that point of plotting it, because there's something very, not just satisfying, but effective at looking at a single risk map that identifies the worst problems. Now, someone might say, oh, well, that other problem of product fraud is very important. Okay, well, let's talk about that. The problem you're talking about, how does that compare to these other problems? Why would you say that one should not be a low likelihood? It should be a high likelihood compared to something else. At this point, we're starting to really identify the really details of that risk, and this sets priority setting. Within this project, we do recommend that you consider countermeasures and control systems to address those very high or high vulnerabilities, because it's great if you present one of those heat maps, risk charts, and there's something in the A zone that you could then start to talk about. Well, now that we're thinking about that, how would we reduce the likelihood? Because you approach that, controlling that, applying the risk treatment to either likelihood or consequence. So the key is there that you reduce the opportunity for it to occur, that's the likelihood, or the consequence. And so now we're getting to some details. When you have that type of example, it can really help really make it more understandable when we're looking at this assessment, and also helping you to see how this will help you as a government body responding to prioritizing and focusing your resources. Also, a real key is then you can defend why you did what you did, because someone could say, what are you doing running over to the north part of the country all the time? You should be down here in the south. Well, then you could start to identify, well, these were our 3 highest focused issues, and we focused on those. They happen to all be in the north. And then you could say, well, if in the south, do you have other ones that you think are that high? And that's starting to really give some real insight to why you're making the decisions that you're making. And then really the real key that really is missed a lot is you do all this, but there really does need to be a final closeout here. And this is propose your food fraud prevention strategy, including a calibration of the food fraud risks on the enterprise risk map. What I mean by propose is it goes from you to whoever the overseer is of your group or agency, so that someone looks at your strategy and sees it and either tells you, I guess, yes, no, or maybe. but a key is you've presented this clear problem. You've identified the risk map, and then you have something very specific to talk about. And they also then, a lot of times, it's really a relief to see something that's very clear, that's been defined and presented. And the key for you is that you now have this plan that you wrote up with the assessment, really clear on what you've clearly defined what your problems are, what you're working on, and why. And for you, that really does help for that strategy. Now, something I'd like to point out is this is not just a theory, and this was a presentation by Wegmans, which is a major grocery store chain, regional in about a quarter of the U.S., and they presented this at the Food Safety Summit in May 2018, and they identified their methodical approach. And on the right, this task force approach. See, task force approach. We just talked about that. And there's a cycle there, and that's a food fraud prevention cycle that I mentioned earlier. And this definitely applies to government agencies. And I got a previous presentation at a different Interpol conference that I'll attach as a link. But a key there is that this is implemented in industry. And you'll notice on the right here, the real key is, well, they work with us, but a key is looking at, they've gone through and defined, creating this task force, doing the training, looking at that mission statement, doing the initial screening, going deeper as well. And this was from a while ago, so they've made advances on it, one would think. And so a key is that we're defining just that this is something that does happen in industry. So there's still probably a skepticism about the ability for this to happen for an entire country. So this is actually something that's in the food fraud textbook in great detail. But this is, we'll just call it Country B. It's a European country food fraud initial screening. Now, one thing we identified at the very start, to be clear, this was just several of us working together. And so we'll say that there's a very low certainty and low robustness. What we mean by that is we're stating very clearly, we didn't have a lot of data. We didn't have a lot of information. We're not real sure about a lot of it, and we didn't take a lot of time on it. But a key is the first step, the need is to get to this assessment. Now that we fill this out, we can start to look at those specific problem areas. Maybe act upon them now, but more importantly is that we all can have a discussion within your group, with your whoever's conducting the oversight, and we can start to define the details. So you'll notice here, this is look at plot on the overall risk map. And what we're looking at here is this summary matrix. And it's looking for outgoing goods and finished goods. Those are red are alcohol and spirits. And then there's a number of the other ones. That blue is meat, seafood, and dairy. And then the other items, there's other products as well. So what we did is we plotted the worst problems. And you'll see that E is one of the worst. The likelihood is very high and the consequence is very high. So across the top is likelihood and across the left is the consequence. So when you look at this, that should be the item that they're working on first. Now, is that very complex? And then there's this next group of products, B, F, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9. Those are obviously the next set of problems that should be addressed. Not 1 and 2 or D and 8 or A. Now those are all still things that are a concern, yes, of course, but they're not the highest priority. Now something at the bottom that's really important that we put there is just to emphasize whenever we present a chart like this is that level of certainty and level of robustness. We want to make sure that we're being clear that this is just a very first pass at the big picture. Now somebody might say you need to do a lot more analysis. Well, right there then they've defined that they want you to do more, and we can start to discuss how much analysis is really needed. Now just to step back, when we looked at these up there, so let's say that those worst problems. We then looked at specifically here is looking at outgoing goods, and this would be finished goods into the marketplace. Now specifically E was the one that was the worst there. So let's look down there, very high, very high. That was product that was going for export. So the problem, I mean, well, yes, the public health threat would be outside your country, but if there's a problem outside your country, then it's going to lead to lack of sales here. And that was specifically meat, seafood, and dairy. So specifically looking at this major concern based on whatever the likelihood and the consequence, that was number one. Let's look at B and F were next. So B would be private bazaar kiosk trolleys. Okay, so different. So that's not looking at it's going to be private sales or some type of informal market. That's very different than looking at the major retailers. You look down there, F, they did have major retailers for alcohol, spirits, and beer, but that was different than looking at the informal markets. And then also in there, C and D were actually look low then. So D was on there. E-commerce or online delivery of alcohol, spirits, and beer. And there, again, looking at likelihood and consequence, we could start to go into the details of why we thought those were a high and a high versus the e-commerce online delivery for other high-valued products that were very high and a low. We can have a very detailed discussion there, and that's really the value of doing it. Again, this took us about, I think, about 2 hours to do for the whole country. Again, very low certainty and very low robustness, but it gives you a great starting point. So for Operation Opson next steps, real key to drill all the way through to this. Consolidate information on incidents. That's one of the most valuable activities moving forward, and that's something that Opson does itself. with the summary reports, but we're looking for even more. Now, the EU with the Food Authenticity Network and others, there's other areas where you're sharing a lot more information. That's great. And then one thing we should see is each country conducts a food fraud suspicious activity report and shares summary results. This is another type of lecture that we'll have on how to conduct that suspicious activity report, but you've got your own assessments of a problem. And when you can share the results between a country, maybe pick just a couple to start with, then you might understand how they're dealing with specific problems, and you might be able to share best practices, or maybe even have some combined activities that reduce the overall likelihood that it could occur. Consolidate information on the root cause of system weaknesses or vulnerabilities. So again, we're looking at the incidents themselves overall, and now looking at why does product fraud occur in one country versus another? Is there something fundamental about the marketplace? Each country conduct their own private food fraud vulnerability assessment, but then start to share the root causes. Shift the focus to crime prevention. This is so difficult because we've been judged on measures. How many tons did you seize? How many handcuffs did you put on people? How many years of prosecution? How many successful prosecutions? But prevention is not that. Prevention is identifying the system weaknesses and getting them under control. Think about the way that food safety is conducted. I mean, the goal is not to have more food safety seizures. The goal is to identify the best practices and then reinforce those best practices that reduce the number of incidents. So again, they're thinking of food safety. We're dealing with food fraud and other food crimes. We have food safety that we can use as a template and example. So identify how, why, where, and the topic where vulnerability occurs, and then discuss how to reduce that hot spot. And that's a real key, that we're applying other criminology theories. We're getting very down to some really great details. Just like to say thank you to a lot of people. Nothing great, really significant happens in a vacuum. I'm so thankful for a lot of the support that I've had. With that, before we take discussion, I'll just say there's a link to the textbook there. If you're interested in any of the training programs, they're free, online, free for anybody. Share them, post them for your country. We have unlimited capacity in the server space for those, so share those widely. There's my information and our website. Thank you. I'll take questions now.